We have a lot to cover because the weeks are dwindling. Next week I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be in London at the Historical Materialism Conference. But next week is Gramsci on the question of party, the new prince, the role of the political party as a revolutionary subject, and the prospects for democracy. And then, of course, on November the 17th, we're going to do Nikos Koulantzas, the last chapter of State Power Socialism, which is on the democratic transition to socialism. Today, there are certain themes that have been unfolding. The beginning, of course, was the question of what democracy is in the strict sense of the term, and the question of the preconditions of democracy. Democracy is possible only among equals, and we had then discussions about, is democracy possible, let's say, in the context of production in these technical fields, what's a technical, what's a political field, when one can be equal, and when inequality is unavoidable in a way. Then you have a system of aristocracy, and that some are better or more capable than others, potentially. Of course, then we had with Marx, and then a bit with Luxemburg last week, the question of the critique of bourgeois, liberal, democratic institutions. Marx, of course, most obviously in the Jewish question, has a very significant critique. A little bit with Castoriadis too, in the beginning, in his laying out, the various, the role of Greek democracy and how it contrasts with the modern state. Today, I think, mainly we'll be discussing the question of space. Space and the ways in which the working class or the popular classes can constitute themselves, let's say, as a subject, as a democratic subject. Because one of the questions in Luxemburg, in her discussion of the Russian Revolution. Of course, here we have, again, she attacks the Social Democrats. From Bernstein we go to Kautsky, she's attacking, of course, Kautsky. And then in the more critical comments on the question of the Russian Revolution is the lament of the dissolving of the Soviets. How the Soviets were dissolved, of course, in the face of, as she recognizes very well, pressures from the West, the invasion of the Soviet Union by the West, and the problems, the many practical problems this created. And in some ways, it's understandable, but at the same time she is critical about that decision. Which leads very much into Pannekoek, who is one of, is probably, I guess, the leading exponent of what is known as Council Communism within that tradition. And his analysis of workers' councils and the radical potentiality of this kind of form of organization among the working class. Then we have Claus Offe, the Two Logic of Collective Action, which is a very, I think, for our purposes, is a very important set of arguments because of the differences between capital and labor when it comes to constituting itself as a subject. And it has to do, of course, with questions of space, spatiality, coming together, which then will lead us to Sartre and the questions of seriality and elections, and how elections function, according to Sartre, in a way that rather than bringing us together as a collective actor, individualize us, separate us into abstracted individuals where we have no potentiality for political power. He sees the elections as a mechanism through which we become individualized and become less and less capable of achieving political power. Any comments so far, questions? No. You're taking a lot of notes, Michael.
I am taking a lot of notes. It's okay. It's good for me, yeah.
So for Luxembourg and the dissolving Soviets, and especially here, I think, in Pannekoek, in the discussion of workers' councils, Pannekoek understands them as basically being strike committees that came together to supervise, to make possible strikes that then evolved in the Soviet Union. And the significance of the workers' councils, it's not, I mean, the workers' councils are not, of course, the same as something like a worker co-op, you know, as we discussed
I hope
in the
you do.
past. Yeah. The workers' councils, I think, have a very important idea, which is that in capitalism, workers are brought into collaboration with each other. When it comes to the factory, for example, we all go, occupy the same space, and act in a relatively speaking harmonious way, or act in collaboration with each other to produce whatever it is that we are producing. And as capitalism develops, there's more and more and more socialization, of course, of labor. There's ever increasing networks of interdependencies, of collaboration, of cooperation that we as workers, let's say, engage in order to produce. So, which is to say, in the economic moment of capitalism, and this is not, of course, a novel idea, we can go back to Marx, of course, you know, capitalism creates its own gravediggers and these kinds of ideas. Capitalism is bringing us together as a collective whole, as a class, in that sense. And not just as a class, but as a community of people who occupy the same space and collaborate with each other on a daily basis. So the workers' councils, in a sense, are made possible on the one hand because of the rise of capitalism, and because now we do come together as a cohesive group for the sake of production to begin with. Of course, Claus Offe will make the point in his piece that in some ways, of course, you know, it's capital who organizes the working class on behalf of its own goals, of course, which is in this case production. And paradoxically, the working class becomes doubly invested in the health of the system. He says the working class is more tied, you know, is more interested in the health of capitalism than even the capitalist class, because the capitalist class can afford to, let's say, stop production more than the working class can. If production is stopped by the bosses, it's less catastrophic for them than it is for them, because the working classes, you know, at that point, they have no means of subsistence. You're in the city. It's not as if you're in the countryside with your farm and your goats and your chickens, and you could potentially survive indefinitely on your own. You're in the city with no job and no money. Now you have a problem. Just up the street last week, there's a new Filipino chicken place that opened up, and people were in line for 20 hours. They were standing in line for 20 hours.
For jobs?
No, for free chicken.
Oh, free chicken.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
Filipino
it was the grand opening
Yeah.
a week from, because when I was walking here last week, I saw these people in line. I said, what the hell is this? And then I saw on the news, 20 hours people waiting in line to get
Chicken?
Where's Gil Scott Heron when we need him?
That's where we are, you know, you wait in line for
Yeah, you're right.
20 hours to get it.
Piece of chicken hanging from their mouth, right?
Filipino, but that's, you know, it's not just any chicken.
That's right.
It's a novelty too. But
really.
Otherwise, I mean, no one.
Duarte. From Marcus to Duarte.
Duterte. Yeah.
Yeah. So the workers' councils, in part, are based upon the growth of of cities, of capitalist production, where workers are brought together, spatially and relationally, in a very close-knit way, and thus the preconditions are there for their own activity as a cohesive group. So, of course, this is a product, one of the beneficial, let's say, dimensions of capitalism. Now, and when we get to Sartre and Nikos Poulantzas in the last week, the question becomes how the political moment of capitalism functions to break away that cohesive a unity that exists in the economic moment of capitalism. If, in the words of Nikos Poulantzas, the state functions to disorganize the working class. And by disorganize the working class, what he means is, in effect, what Jean-Paul Sartre here is discussing as seriality, is how the ideological, legal, political moment of capitalist societies break us up into juridical individuals. Individuate us, serialize us in a way that make our existence as a cohesive group less possible. And that's it. We can talk about schooling, we can talk about, in this case, voting, right? How you vote as an individual. You wait in a line, you're serialized. You have to go behind the curtain, as Sartre mentions, to pull the lever, as if we can't trust each other. I should be suspicious of you and vice versa. I don't want you to see which way I voted.
Well, it's not we're suspicious of each other. We're suspicious of the police watching which way we're voting. I mean, that was the whole purpose of that kind of voting system.
Or if we're selling,
or us,
or if we're selling our vote.
Or we all sell our vote.
Yeah, that can be, yeah. But what? But who are the police?
There's no choice.
I mean,
What
who are
would
the
be
police?
police?
Well, it's like in the
I'm
unions.
just saying.
The unions, no longer you have secret ballots, right? In most of the unions,
Right.
it used to be you raised your hand at the meeting, so the people that thought
know.
you voted the wrong way
Would beat you up when
could
you
tell
went
you and
outside.
beat you up. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, but in a way, that was a different kind of politics than what you have
Well,
today.
that's-
This privatization, it's not as
I'm
much a
not-
public
I'm
sphere.
not arguing that. I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, yeah.
There was a historical reason.
Right, right,
But it was not
right.
an ideological reason why
Right.
they have secret ballots. There was a very practical, historical reason.
Uh-huh.
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive,
Yeah, I don't either.
No, they're not.
because the police are our neighbors too.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? It's
I do
not-
know what you
yeah,
mean.
They don't come from a
Yes.
different planet.
No.
yeah.
Or if you see something, say
Some of them.
Yeah. I mean, my suggestion, as we talked about, is that we should always
If you see how
Should
Peter
be-
votes,
I think
tell
they do come
someone.
from another country.
always foreigners who serve as, population,
That's right.
exchanges, like,
So
for
there's,
now, there are the people who are,
Those
in
Mexican
effect,
refugees, those
they-
Honduran refugees that are coming across the border.
they would make very good
Kill
police,
us,
exactly.
kill us.
That's a very, yeah.
Yeah.
You might
You're
get
gonna
a
take
call
her.
from the administration.
I'm going there next, well, I'm
You're
going,
going, huh?
yeah, I'm going next week.
Good, yeah.
But they're very far away. They won't be there next week, will they?
No, they won't, but we were planning this thing for, a year. We did it last year and the year before. It's this Encuentro in Nogales.
Yeah, like as a show of support.
Yeah.
'Cause there'll be
Yeah,
no one
and
there to help.
educational as well. We
Yeah.
do a bunch of educational workshops. and
There are
stuff
always
like
people
that.
showing up at the border asking for asylum.
Oh, yeah,
Always,
there are
every day.
people there anyway.
Yeah.
But we're not so much there for, it's more, we have a thing at the detention center, demanding that they be released, because there's 2,000 people in a prison there. And then go down to the border and march through the border, and do educational workshops and a demonstration.
There'll be a lot more military there this time, I guess.
It's hard to say, You know, you never know what's gonna happen. I mean, last year we thought we were gonna have more trouble, but it was about the same. You know, what we thought that with Trump, you know, it would be bigger problems, but it didn't turn out that way. It was about the same. Although this year they're doing kind of a Berlin Wall thing. They're, where we used to be right up against the wall on the Mexican side, and then they wouldn't let us set anything up on the U.S. side. So we just pull in a flatbed truck, and we had a sound system on the Mexican side, you know, that we could set up. And so
When you lost in the rain in Juarez,
a flatbed truck and Bluetooth mics to broadcast across the border. You know? But yeah, that worked out pretty well.
Yeah, good.
But this year they're now doubling up on the fence, on the wall. There's the regular wall, and then they built another wall. So it's becoming like the Berlin Wall, where there's a no man's land. You know?
And that's on the American side, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you a.
You have flyers?
Yeah, I got flyers.
Good.
Here.
I saw, I think in the paper today that they figured about 200 million.
Oh, I got some of these last week.
The expense of the deployment of the troops along the border.
Yeah, well, I don't know what they're going to do with them. I mean, they've always had some troops.
Okay, it's good for
They're
the-
going to have
Luckily, the Pentagon
a
has
fight
got a
with
big
the militia
raise,
that's
so-
also going
Yeah, they
there.
have the
They can
money to
afford it.
spend. Let them,
They
yeah,
can
let
money.
them better
Money
that
to
than
burn.
just spending it on more bombs. And
Yeah. Well, the militias are a bunch of
Crazy.
crazies. You know, I mean, they actually. There's a woman doing a workshop. She lives in Arivaca, which is a border town, and they killed 2 people. The militias killed 2 people because they in her town because they thought they accused them of running drugs, and so they went into their house and killed them.
Oh, wow.
That was
In
a couple.
Mexico?
That was a few. No, in the U.S.
Oh, U.S.
In Arizona, Arivaca, Arizona. But
so these right-wing militia people.
yeah,
broke into the house.
right wing militias. Yeah,
Did
they're.
they get arrested?
Yeah, I don't know where that case is though. To tell you the truth, there's also a case of a guy who a border patrol agent who shot across the border through the fence and killed a kid on the Mexican
That went to
side.
trial.
Yeah, there is a trial actually, and actually it's happening. May have already happened.
It already happened.
Yeah.
They dismissed the charges.
There you go. Cops can do no wrong, even when they're shooting across international frontiers at unarmed kids. It's like, yeah, now that Israel can do it, everybody can do it.
Yeah, that's right there.
Anyway,
But Trump took back, because I think he suggested some days ago that maybe they should shoot the people trying to come across the border.
Yeah, but
And now I
Nigeria
think
took
yesterday
them
he said, well,
seriously.
no, maybe that's not a good idea. We shouldn't shoot. What do you say, Brett?
No, I just read in the paper this morning that there were demonstrators shot, or rock throwers, better said, shot dead in Nigeria, and they cited Trump's
Yes.
yeah,
exhortation that rock is the same as a rifle. Both start with R, and when you're in the 2nd grade, like Trump is, it may as well be the same.
Well, it depends on the rifle and the rock these days. You have to be very strong to throw the rock. So anyone wants to say anything about Luxembourg? I know some people have a lot to say on this question of Luxembourg and the Russian Revolution. I mean, we have a repetition of the critique of social democracy and people, Kautsky, of course, directly here. I mean, it's no longer Bernstein who is the other side. It's Kautsky.
She also indirectly, I mean, the trouble is she was in jail when she wrote these notes, and she only had information that was sort of coming to her
Right, that's right.
secondhand. So
Right.
she was trying to figure out what was going on.
Right.
But there is also, in a way, she revives her criticisms that she had previously made of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, saying, if this is what's going on, I mean, at one point she repeats the old phrase that, freedom is only freedom for people who are arguing against you or opposed for your political opponents.
Right.
Right.
She criticized their suppression of political debate and discussion that she has heard is going on in Russia. So she sees this as hopeful, right?
Mhm.
But she's trying to figure out where it's going at that point. The Soviets aren't dissolved at that point. The Soviets are technically the foundation of the Soviet Union. That's why it's called the Soviet
Right.
Union. But in practice, as we know,
They weren't, yeah.
political life was being
Not enough
slowly
electrification, yeah.
being
Right,
disappearing.
right.
The only political life was happening inside the Bolshevik Party. And that was what she had always warned against,
Right.
going back to 1903 and 1905.
I mean, she's critical of them, stopping, pausing. She has the line, which is, of course, a very important one, where she says,
Is
I
the
don't know
Russian Revolution you're reading from?
What essay are
Yeah.
you in?
Okay.
this is from the Russian Revolution, the chapter 1. It's about 7-8 pages into it. And she says, in this, the Russian Revolution has but confirmed the basic lesson of every great revolution, the law of its being, which decrees, after the revolution must advance at a rapid, stormy, and resolute tempo, break down all barriers with an iron hand, and place its goals ever further ahead, or it is quite soon thrown backwards behind its feeble point of departure and suppressed by counter-revolution. So here, she's setting up, of course, we could contrast the October Revolution to Chile, or, where
Right.
when you
That-
stop and
you
you say,
can't-
well, we need to slow down and consolidate, you're going to get overthrown from the
Well,
right.
There's a great, actually very good piece on Brazil and the mistakes that the Workers' Party made, and now, now they've got neo-fascism.
Oh, yeah.
Well, but there wasn't a revolution in Brazil. I mean,
No.
there were elections, and they
No,
elected
but
a
they-
left-wing
but they
government.
didn't
Same in
move.
Chile, there was all elections.
But-
Yeah, but in
many
Chile, it's a
Chile
much
was-
more.
Yeah, yeah, it's much more, yeah,
revolutionary.
no, I'm
Chile, there
aware
was
of
something
that.
much more
Yeah, yeah.
profound.
Yeah, yeah, no,
But there
definitely.
still wasn't a revolution in Chile.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
So there's a
Right.
big difference.
Right.
But there could have
There
been.
could have, maybe there could have been,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
good.
And the critique is that they didn't go
Far enough, fast
far
enough.
enough, and they kept trying to, keep the elites happy, and had they actually been the champions of the workers as they were when they first came in, then perhaps they would.
Speaking of Brazil now,
Brazil.
the Workers' Party.
Yeah, the Workers' Party of
Yeah.
Brazil,
Well,
because
I mean,
they're going to be destroyed.
It's,
Yeah.
not clear, but it's not, but anyway, it's a different situation. In Russia, you really had a dual power situation in
Right.
1917. The
Right.
Soviets
Sure.
were not the creation
Sure.
of the Bolshevik Party.
Right.
They were, I don't want to say spontaneous, that would not be exactly true, but they arose out of the working class.
Right.
They established
the
themselves as a
Soviets.
dual power, the Soviets, the councils,
Yeah.
in part because the provisional government was not strong. And in a lot of big cities in Russia, the Soviets ended up basically being the administrative power because the old government had fallen apart and the new government wasn't strong enough or competent to do anything. So they set up this, they set up a situation. Lenin comes back to Russia and revived a slogan that had arisen in 1905 and said, well, the Soviets are the
All
functioning
power to the
government.
Soviets, yeah.
They should
Yeah.
declare themselves the
Mhm.
functioning government
Mhm.
of Russia.
Mhm.
And it's funny that, we're not reading The State and Revolution, but in The State and Revolution, Lenin describes his ideal of what he sees the Soviets as a new kind of state that rules from the bottom up,
Right.
that's ruling from the bottom up. In the process of the Civil War and everything, whatever their intentions were, it didn't work out that way. So,
Yeah, well,
You know.
it was- somebody tried to assassinate him, so.
I think, yes, a couple times, but anyway, well, he was
Well,
almost killed once.
Yeah,
But,
the time he almost got killed was when they
His
initiated
former allies.
the Red Terror.
It wasn't the rightists, it was his former allies
Yeah.
that tried to kill him. But Luxemburg in this is, she's trying to work her way through this. She wants this to succeed.
Right.
And so she's saying, you know, to people like Kautsky and that who are saying, oh, you know, this is brutal, this is horrible, da, 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 da.
And she equates them to the Mensheviks.
Yeah,
the-
well,
the Kautsky
rightly,
line.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the Mensheviks were like saying,
Yeah.
oh. But on the other hand, she's also saying, but I see dangers here. Not from, because the working class is being, I think she sees the dangers that the working class is being, as you would say, turned from a subject into an object. But the
So
working
this
class,
is
in the
based
beginning
on
of the revolution, the
notion of
working
the
class
party
was,
as a
the working class,
vanguard.
yes.
I mean, the critique of a vanguardism. Yeah, I see where you're going, yeah.
And the elimination of certain kinds of freedoms. I mean, if the last page of the chapter on suffrage, this question of suffrage, you know, she goes into this, you know, some of the problems of freedom of the press and so forth, where she says, this is the last paragraph, but the Constituent Assembly and the suffrage law do not exhaust the matter. We did not consider above the destruction of the most important democratic guarantees of a healthy public life and of the political activity of the laboring masses. Freedom of the press, the rights of association assembly, which have been outlawed for all opponents of the Soviet regime. For these attacks on democratic rights, the arguments of Trotsky cited above on the cumbersome nature of democratic electoral bodies are far from satisfactory. On the one hand, it is well known and indisputable fact that without a free and untrammeled press, without the unlimited right of association assemblage, the rule of the broad mass of the people is entirely unthinkable. So it was, on the one hand, of course, the Constituent Assembly became left aside in the, you know, after the counter-revolutionary fight intensifies, and then, of course, the suppression of what she sees as necessary. I mean, there might be bourgeois liberties, but she's arguing here, of course, they're fundamental for any possibility of popular sovereignty, that there has to be freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and so forth. Otherwise, it's a moot point, this question of power from below. And this will be again repeated you know, we're not going to read that part, but Nicholas Polanzas repeats her critique of these arguments.
Oops, I'm sorry.
The state power socialism against, you know, this, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And they had there was a debate in France in the mid-70s between Etienne Balibar and Nicholas Polanzas on this question.
Really?
Yeah, because Balibar wrote a book, Dictatorship of the Proletariat.
What was it called?
The Dictatorship of the Proletariat.
Case.
The Dictatorship of the
Oh, the
Proletariat.
dictatorship.
Yeah.
Couldn't hear.
He wrote a book, and he was supposed to have written it with Althusser, but Althusser was in the hospital. You know, they had put him in the hospital at one point. So he wrote it while he was in the hospital, and then they published it like that. Now he, you know, one time he came to my place for a coffee, and I mentioned the book. I said, let me get you, I have the book, I had it in my shelf. And he, no, I don't want, please don't bring it, I don't want to see it. You know, it was a mistake, I don't agree with it anymore, and so he's changed his position. But there was a debate on this notion of a dictatorship of the proletariat.
I mean, what it means? Or?
What it means, and also, you know, its utility as a revolutionary idea.
Well, I guess, we haven't, probably this is no longer a phrase that it's possible to even use productively anymore for reasons, but it meant something at one time, and it came to mean something else entirely in the 20th century. I mean,
But if let's say, if
like in
the
report.
contrast
Oh, yeah,
is,
go ahead.
let's say we, in the broadest sense, we have a contrast which is either a vanguardist position versus, because what Pannekoek, for example, is like, for him, the workers' councils are a transitionary moment. It's not the end of the struggle. It's not the goal. It's not the
No.
final goal. It's and he says everything is transitionary in a sense because nothing is permanent.
Something's always going to
Yeah.
something else.
But he sees it as a transitionary moment where the workers, in the broadest sense of the term, of course, workers, through the councils, are able to reorganize the basic systems of production and distribution that exist in a society.
And
And
the state.
make something to go beyond that more possible. That, you no longer have to worry about food and these things, That the area, as it were, of the mere life is taken care of. And then possibly then you can move beyond those questions. It's no longer, we need to struggle for shelter and food and clothing and so forth. That gets taken care of. And that opens up, of course, many new political possibilities, as well as we could add, he doesn't really emphasize this much, but we could add the experience of the council in itself is, of course, one that makes possible new societies, new realities. For the
Is Pannekoek coming out of, were there workers' councils in the Netherlands
Well, I think that the experience of
or of the
what
German?
happened in Russia
Germany?
was, of course, very important in Germany.
Yeah.
I don't know in Holland. I mean, there must have been something. I don't know if there were any great consequence. They worked the way they were
Yeah.
in these other places.
Because, Claus was really involved with the workers' council movement in Germany.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. Well, he's the other big,
Yeah.
important thinker of council communism,
Right.
as it were. And then, Pannekoek much later, in the 50s, he was in correspondence with Castoriadis because he was reading their journal,
Mhm.
Socialism or Barbarism, and they had some correspondence where he was a little bit critical on some issues, but of course, very sympathetic to the project overall.
Yeah.
What was the journal, Socialism or Barbarism?
Yeah.
When was that a journal?
From 1948 or 49, somewhere around there, until 61, 62. And it was Claude Lefort and Castoriadis who were the main forces behind the journal. It was a very important journal, critiquing the Soviet Union, and not only that, I mean other things, but from the left. It was to the left of, way to the left of the Communist Party of the day. And it was the first real left critique of, and Castoriadis himself, I mean, we read him in the beginning, I don't think I mentioned, but he was very, he was just, in some ways, very courageous, because when he was still in Greece, in the middle of the Civil War, he was against both sides, and both sides were looking to kill him. Yeah, he was against the communists, for the reasons that we can understand, but, in 1946, it was a little bit unusual to have that line. And of course, he was also against the other side, against the Royalists, the Nationalists, so they were both looking to kill him. And of course, he escaped on the famous ship, the Mataroa, that Michael wrote about a couple of years ago. That was, included many other important intellectuals, and they were able to flee to Paris. And there he worked under a pseudonym, not under his real name. When he was part of social barbarism, no one knew who he was, because he was in France as a guest, he was not French. So if they found out who he was, they would have kicked him out, probably. So he had many pseudonyms, mostly under the name Paul Claudin. And then when he became a French citizen much later, then he came out, in his own name, and was writing in his own name. But then he only wrote under aliases.
What was the name?
Paul Cardin. There were many of them. That was, I think it was the most common one he used. So it was, unusual to be, but as was Korsch and Pannekoek, let's say, from that standpoint, they were unusual because the main divisions, whether it be Trotskyist or Stalinist or whatever, were to the right of this idea that, you have to have these popular assemblies, you have to have constituent power from below and these various institutions. And for, I think, Pannekoek, it's really a necessary moment that you take advantage of the economic organization that exists under capitalism, which is to bring the workers together, and you use that to your advantage. You intensify that. You have not only the workers take over the production,
Right.
which which for him is
So
necessary.
eventually they take over the state.
The state becomes obsolete, he says.
Yeah.
You don't need it anymore
Yeah.
because you have these workers' councils. And then at some point, of course, they will transition to something else. Who knows? You can't predict the future. But I think he saw the councils as practically, strategically, the way forward. Because and it's, I think if we look at it in this context of space and bringing people together, it makes sense.
That's still going on. In fact, there's movements now in Latin America that, not so much in terms of factory councils, but in terms of communities basically declaring their independence from the state
Right.
and saying that they are self-governing bodies away from the state.
Right.
Well, because the state's so brutal and is brutalizing them anyway, so they might as well,
Right. Nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Well, we have, of course, the Paris Commune and all these other examples of this.
Examples.
But if the Paris Commune is an example of a revolutionary possibility because people live together as a city, right? People are brought together and live in a cohesive way as a community because they all live in the same space, right, the same place as a city. I think the parallel argument here is when people come together in the context of capitalist economic production and work together as a cohesive unity, then that makes that possible. And if you negate that through, let's say, a kind of vanguardist organization, you in effect neutralize that possibility that is imminent to the economic moment, which is that people already are socializing with each other or collaborating as workers, and that can then be extended beyond the workplace or beyond the factory walls to something more expansive, where he says you no longer have to divide between politics and economics. It becomes undone.
Yeah. Well, of course.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, just that of course was like, he wrote a scathing piece against the SPD for destroying the workers' councils, essentially making them into mere unions.
Right.
So,
Which
And
workers'
this-
council?
the German workers'
I know when.
1919.
1919. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, the German Revolution is a very complicated subject, but the factory councils, which is what they had, were sort of, they were that, factory councils. They were concerned with workplace conditions. The KPD, when it broke away from the SPD, believed that those could become the same as the Soviets in Russia. They never quite worked out that way, in part because the KPD didn't have never won the kind of influence. The most horrible, tragic thing about that is that the closest they got to it in Germany was at the Kapp putsch at the end of 1919, when a section of the German military revolted against the Weimar, tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And there was a general strike in Germany. Workers went out, they organized councils, basically to defend their republic. The Communist Party at first refused to take part in this. They said, oh, that's a bourgeois republic, we're not going to defend it, to hell with that. And it was only after they realized that the extent that this had mobilized the workers that they belatedly came in and said, okay, yeah, we're in with it. But they did a lot to discredit themselves by they had their own vision of what was supposed to happen, because they were supposed to be the leaders of the working class. And when the working class did this without their leadership, then they said, we don't want anything to do with it, which is a big problem frankly, with communist parties in many places, that it's either they run it or it's wrong. No matter
Well, you see it now. I mean, yeah. It's the same way in Greece, obviously.
Yeah, I was thinking of, like, when you were talking, I was thinking of how to bring, like, I was just trying to think about bringing the idea of workers' council into the present day moment. And so that I was thinking about the importance of having a mass base with deep roots in both workplace and community whenever you have a political opening. And I think that atrophied in Greece under Syriza, unless I'm wrong, and also in Brazil under the PT. Lula, became dependent on building coalitions in Congress. Was very dependent on that, and in fact really couldn't have operated as well if there'd been a disruptive mass presence in the streets. So, I'm just like wondering if that's a way that this idea, can be brought into the present day.
Well, I don't think it was any real, in Greece, for example, the labor unions, the trade unions, have been for a long time under there was a moment, maybe in the 70s, where things were different, but, of the last 30, 40 years, they've all been under the control of political parties. They're affiliated to political parties, they're party organizations, in effect. And they never had a great capacity for this kind of, nothing close to, of course, what we're talking about here, which is, because first of all, they have that sectarian division that divides them as potential collaborators and cohesive agents.
They're extensions of the parties.
Yeah. And even in the events, let's say, leading up to the rise of Syriza, there were general strikes, which continued even after, in some the rise of Syriza, but they were never of any great consequence, the general strikes, let's say. And there was never a capacity, an internal capacity, to really disrupt the society in a fundamental way that would force, let's say, some kind of capitulation or some change in the political direction. So it's much more simple, let's say, than I think what you're suggesting, what happened in at least in the case of Greece. And I suspect in Brazil as well, because in Brazil, to the degree that there were mass movements, they were also affiliated to certain party, whether it was the landless peasants or it was
the MST was pretty independent, actually. That they had a big argument about whether they were going to go with the PT,
right.
And they decided not to.
But they didn't, right?
No, they did not.
Yeah.
But now everybody's screwed.
Yeah. But they were pretty cohesive as a faction unto themselves.
Oh,
It
yeah,
wasn't,
yeah, and still are.
Yeah. But I think, in one question we have, of course, in this context is the change in the labor process in how what Pannekoek is discussing here is much less true today.
Yeah.
Because if it was true 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 80, 100 years ago, that the working class is being brought together in these big
These
cities,
giant
working in these big
factories.
factories, and we are,
And usually they're living in the same neighborhood as the factory,
Exactly,
too.
exactly.
Different, big
you
and
know,
very.
if that was true, obviously at one point. Today, it's much less clear that anything
Well,
like
now
that
it's
is
all
going on.
atomized in just-in-time production and all
Right,
that.
and I
crap.
think this is really an important discussion and point to make in terms of the possibilities, the democratic possibilities of the moment. Because I think Pannekoek is correct that you have to look at the existing ways of production and life to see, right, this coming together and the possibilities. So it's not going to be workers' council simply because we like workers more than other groups necessarily, right? It's that those are the groups as contrasted to, at one point he says, you know, in the villages when you had the co-ops, you know, it was peasants who were separated into their, you know, and then what did they do? They took the land from the rich people and they privatized it. They privatized the land, so they had that separation. They kept separated. But the working class, you have the cohesion. They're coming together, working in collaboration, so they really have that internal capacity
Oh, sorry.
and the possibility for something beyond these, you know, individualistic bourgeois notions of liberty and the rest. Today, it's a very different situation because of the way that production has been reorganized. And, of course, the way that suburbanization, maybe, or other spatial ways of living have mitigated that coming together that was characteristic of industrial capitalism, let's say.
So where do we see this spatial proximity in today's society?
Electronically.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm sorry.
There is
No,
that.
it's
Yes,
There is
it's
that.
true.
That's
Electronic
true.
disturbance.
Yeah.
I mean, all this kind of avant-garde thinking through musicians and other stuff,
But
that's just
there
really
is
where we
also
are.
this, there has been I mean, you see these giant industrial cities that they're building from scratch in China and places.
Yes.
You know, that's,
Yeah.
that's really for the purpose of bringing labor together into one place. So there's that.
And selling apartments.
And so-
Well. But they
that's
wouldn't be able
yeah,
to sell apartments if
there
people
weren't
hadn't
people,
go there
yes.
to. if
They have
people
a
didn't
few
to
here
live there to
too,
work.
you know.
Well, I'm saying it.
Yeah,
also
yeah, they're
there's a
all here.
No,
That's why the lights
there's
are
a
off.
revival of, there is a revival of central cities in
Right,
the West
right.
to some
Right,
extent.
yeah.
Also,
Oh, and also you have the
Yeah.
suburbanization of the big cities.
Yeah.
and
Yeah, what we're really living through is the suburbanization of
And-
the cities
yeah.
with vertical building.
yeah.
This is the interesting thing. It's a kind of suburbanization with verticality instead of the horizontality and, you know, spatial, you know. Yeah, it's a very new kind of, production of space and social space. It's a very, I think it's a very different phenomenon that we're witnessing here than just the transformation of bringing the countryside to the city,
Right.
or in China, the beginning of the end of the peasantry, or the, you know, etc.
But I think if you look at it from the standpoint of what Offe argues
Okay, that's where you
here
are.
in the two logic.
Which I haven't read.
It's,
Yeah.
it's,
Okay,
it's,
yeah.
I haven't read that.
narrowly speaking, it's a critique of rational choice theory and this emphasis on interest groups, you know, by saying, look, you can't, when it comes to at least capital and labor, what we mean by collective action and the logic of collective action are not the same, they're different. Because when you talk about collective action by labor, you're talking about workers. It's people coming together to collectively, let's say, work towards some kind of common goal or some kind of political end. When it comes to capital, it's not living people. Right? We're talking about dead labor in that sense,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So when you talk about dead labor, you talk about, then it's, it's units of capital, ever greater amounts coming together, functioning as one. So that already is one difference, right? To get $1 billion, let's say, acting as one, is a different kind of logic than getting 10,000 workers together, 10,000 human beings together and acting as one. And in this context, these new technological ways in which we interact and we communicate and so forth make the first much more possible. Today, you can go on the computer and move a few billion without, very quickly.
More than a few.
More than a few, but for illustrative purposes. Whereas now, more and more and more of people who are in the dominant classes are not only alienated by, as we talked about before, the 1844 manuscript,
Right.
commodity form,
Right.
but now you have the screens, these new means of communication, the digitized world, that it is an additional layer of alienation. Makes it less possible for us to come together to function as one, because we are, in a sense, alienated even more through the
Yeah.
screens.
I
Yeah,
mean-
but as you pointed out, and maybe, and like in the case, you've used the Arab Spring as an example, it also, there's always the other side of that coin, which is that it makes it possible for people who aren't in the physical proximity, don't know each other, never had anything to do with each other to communicate and come together.
But they have to come together in the square.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they have to
If
come
they-
together
if
in
they
the
stay-
square
yeah,
To
itself.
be a power,
Yeah.
to be a
Right,
power,
right,
they had to
yeah.
come together
Yeah.
in the square, that's
I mean,
right.
yes, you can connect from Montreal,
Yes.
Occupy Wall Street to Arab Spring and all of these things. You do simultaneously. I mean, this is one power that is there, but at the same time, again, I mean, I remember a class, Eric Keller, who's a very good Germanist at Northwestern, he used to say postmodernism is based on the airport. Everything is based on our
That's
travel.
why- that's why I hate
the
it.
airport. Yeah, exactly. Right. He used to say
The
that.
airport
But
of
it seems
postmodern.
like what we're talking about now, everything is
Torture
based on the
places.
technological hub. Right? This is what the new suburbanization is really about. It's no longer about just the airport in Queens or this, airport in Denver or whatever. It's now based on these technological hubs constantly, right?
Which
Yeah,
appears the
yeah,
rule
yeah.
have the ability to maximize the conditions that are created on the ground by people actually coming together. Because the
Right.
studies we have of the Arab Spring and specifically what happened in Egypt, it seems that yes, they maximize something that was happening already on the ground already with the unions for years. So it seems that the one sort of needs the other, and it's not a
Yeah.
sufficient condition or to replace the concept of
No, but I'm just saying the truth that this kind of technological communication contributes to alienation, but it also has.
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
also
I'm
the
saying
other side.
recognizing the positive
Yeah.
effects
The
and how you
dialectic
can properly
of it.
Yeah.
maximize
Yeah.
what can happen.
But,
like
you know,
in
part,
schools and,
yeah, part
but,
of the. go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah.
not
I mean, at one
replace
point,
it.
Marx makes the argument that the density of the population is a larger product of the systems of communication.
Right.
That the more intensive communication we have, the more dense, in a
Right,
sense, the
right.
society becomes. That said, the form it takes is not irrelevant.
No.
So the fact that the communicative machinery today operates through the screen, and we have Chris here can comment on the problem of spectacle, and the problem spectacle creates, let's say.
She's good at that.
I know, that's why I say it, that's why,
I think the issue of the spectacle is that we've moved beyond representation, where representation only represents itself. There is no originary.
There's no there.
Boy, did you learn
There's
from
no
the
there
Heidegger
there.
lectures. Wow. Yeah, that's good.
But the fact that now
Like
so much of our interactions
here.
are mediated through the screens, and things take the form of whether it's through memes and all these other things, that rather than it acting simply as a more effective and efficient means of communication, where we have in that sense that increased density of population, it is much more in a way of preventing people coming together
Yeah.
as a collective, let's say.
Well, that's a double-edged sword. I mean, things like the Arab Spring would not have arisen without Twitter.
That's what we're saying.
Nor would Al-Sisi be in power. I mean, that's the double-edged sword, really.
Well, one is
Yeah.
sufficient and the
In
other
some
is
ways.
necessary.
In some ways, you know.
He had a
just
little
like,
help
you
from
know.
his friends in Riyadh, too. you know.
Yeah, yeah, no, of course, of course. Well, that, you know, that goes without saying.
Money still
I mean, the
talks.
interesting thing is that at least the movements of the these were secret societies. These were not people that were out there in a sense. They were building movements secretly as well. I mean, the
Bolsheviks?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Oh,
I mean, these
But
are secret
does this work
societies
in
that
our-
that are going on. I mean, you know, in a certain way. I mean, you know.
Would this
it's
work
done-
in this society,
Yes, that's a
secretive?
good question. That's a very
I
good
mean,
question.
do we have to not change our methods and strategies
it's a
to
good
meet
question.
what's going on now, including the screen?
Yes.
I mean, if we're going to be revolutionaries, we have to be revolutionaries of the spectacle as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a constant discussion of it going on, you know. I mean, about how to develop better cloaking technologies, how to, you know, develop better communication technologies, you
Ooh.
know, amongst people who would like to see a change in the system.
I don't know if we need to develop better. I think we need to use them better.
I mean, hasn't capitalism always found ways to organize, to disorganize working people and organize everyday life to encourage passivity?
Sure, Andre's mom.
Well, I
So-
mean, you have that tension. I mean, that's part of the question, because on the one hand, the argument has been, at least in terms of Pannekoek and Bratsis in the early 70s, that capitalism creates the working class, obviously, right? And not only that, brings people together in a specific place and time in a collaborative way, and then makes possible that their emergence as a political subject. But in terms of its political and juridical
Oh,
existence,
yeah, yeah,
works the
exactly.
opposite
Right,
way.
right,
Works to
exactly.
undo that,
Exactly.
to neuter that
Yeah,
possibility. And we could say, and this is a difference between Offe and Bratsis. Bratsis argued the state functions to organize the capitalist class by giving them these institutional spaces within which they come face to face together, and they will create some strategy for accumulation, you know, under the dominance of, let's say, some hegemonic faction of capital. Today, maybe it would be finance capital, financialized capital, that within that there is a cohesive, medium-term at least, strategy that unifies the capitalist class and creates what are, in effect, the objective interests of capitalism, which today maybe there is some disparity because you have a question of free trade, closed borders, tariffs. You know, it seems a little bit things are, for the first time in a long time, a little bit in flux. If it amounts to much of anything, it's too soon to tell, you know, at this point. But
Yeah, no, things are definitely in flux.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think neoliberal capitalism is kind of on the wane, and there's a collapse of its political hegemony anyway.
right. Well, you know, at least now it seems less certain than it did 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, nobody's
Earlier.
running around going Tina anymore.
Well,
They are, but
from the others,
but
yeah.
it
We
rings a
we
little.
have the question.
It rings a little hollow.
Phil, we've anticipated this. We have a question already. Is there an alternative? Question mark.
Yeah, of course.
It's a very real question for
Of
us
course.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Stiegler says there are many alternatives. So that was his response to Tina. But, you know, this is a real question going forward. Is there an alternative to this?
Right.
You know, and where's the starting point?
Yeah.
You know, and,
Well, Stiegler finds technology as the pharmacon, both the toxicity and the antidote.
Right, right.
That's
Well, that's
like-
Heidegger too. Technology finally will reveal its liberating potential. In the meantime, we're dominated by
Yeah,
it.
in the meantime, get rid of it.
Right, right, right. You know. Right.
I think
That's right.
he's a technophobe as far as I could tell.
Who's that, Heidegger? Well, he talked about that ultimately it would reveal its liberating power. This is in the question concerning technology. Yeah, anyway, but yeah, who knows? You know, maybe he was smoking something that day that, you know, was,
Heidegger?
yeah.
So that duality, I think, of the logics, of the spatial dimensions of what capitalism entails, from the standpoint of labor, from the standpoint of dead labor, capital, really, I think, is an important part of any contemporary analysis of the possibilities, political possibilities of the time. And of,
I
you know, the
wonder if we're
possibilities for
still
democracy.
dealing with capitalism, or is
Well,
it
we're
a
dealing
new
with
We're dealing
form?
with capitalism, but the
whatever you
question,
wanna call
we're in
it.
the circuit still.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not outside the circuit of capitalism yet. I mean, we may need new forms of how the circuitry is working at this point. You know, I spoke to this a little bit.
And don't
about
forget, dead
the-
labor requires living labor.
Yes,
or
Yes,
right, of
surplus
course,
value.
of
So
course, of course. Yeah,
somehow they have to
right,
bring people together to work.
right,
Yeah.
right, absolutely.
And if anything, it shows much more, I mean, very clearly, I mean, Pannekoek, of course, makes this point for, and often repeats it in some ways, but certainly it's true today, that if anyone is interested in a healthy capitalism, it's the working classes. I mean, it's so perverse that
Yeah.
whether it's in Brazil, or it's in the United States, or it's in Greece, or it's in the UK, or whatever, you have on the one hand a capitalist speculative class that is happy to destroy its long-term potentialities and prospects, whereas the working class
Well, it can't
is
help
very
it.
much struggling to rationalize the system to make it more healthy so they can survive,
And it moves toward fascism then.
does.
Or towards socialism.
We're back to the old, with our friend.
I mean, Rosa Luxemburg
Yeah.
pointed that out
Right.
in her
Yeah.
Right,
response to
right,
Bernstein,
right,
how
that's right,
the workers have a stake in
right.
capitalism's
Absolutely.
prosperity, but
Absolutely.
capitalism proceeds in its merry way towards,
right.
destroying the basis of its own existence.
So it's a perverse world, I mean, then and now. But it's, one where the workers are much more
Not in the
invested in the
creative
health
sense
of
of perverse
capitalism.
either,
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
it's just perverse, yeah.
You think in terms of spatiality, there are a couple of, interesting things. First of all, all the people who are doing, piecework and stuff from home, technological workers, they're all necessarily interconnected, I mean, they,
Yes.
even though no matter they could be hired from some far away and they may not know, but at some point in the process of their work, they're going to interact with other people who are doing the same thing and have the same interests. And then the other angle of it is the production on demand, when you think about Amazon is recreating the giant, in their distribution centers and so forth, they're recreating the giant factories
Sure.
of 100 years ago.
Of course, yeah.
But I don't know if
Yeah,
you have, you still have, of course, now they're moving to the robots.
Yeah.
I had
Fewer people will be doing the
Yeah, I had
same
one
amount of
student.
work, sure.
who now got a job at Amazon, so he can't come to the class. And he doesn't want to drop the class. So the solution we found, he comes in once a week and we just talk for an hour or so in my office. So that, because it's too late to drop the classes. But he got a job in Amazon in Staten
Wow.
Island. So he told me the process, how it works. So there's these little robots, small, like the size of a book, but they
Right,
can
right.
lift a lot.
Getting ready for
The
the
little
drums,
robots
yeah.
bring you the stuff and you scan them. There are some things that only, but a lot, it says there aren't as many people anymore working in the warehouse. Because now they're moving to so even Amazon is,
No, the
Mech-
automation
autom-
is,
Mechanized and automated, yeah.
that
yeah,
can only become more and more.
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
But
So-
all that stuff costs them,
They got nothing
They
but
got
cash.
nothing but money.
Nothing but money. We have books for
That's a lot
burning,
of
they
money.
have cash to burn. The cash burn rate is
I
very
saw
small.
this thing on the New York Public
Yeah.
Library, that's how they
now get books from their basement.
Right.
When you call for one, nobody, there's no person that
There's a
goes there and
robot
gets
that brings it up?
Yep.
Oh, I'll
There's this
have to
little
try
train. It's
that.
like a little
Yeah, okay.
train.
Yeah.
They showed it. They took somebody down there and showed it. It's like a little electric train, you know, like toy train that goes and gets the book and then runs it on a little track up to the desk.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Well, you can at Montreal, there's a Quebec National Library, it's a very nice library, actually, where I work all the time. You know, instead of having people where you give the books back to or the bin, you just put it in the machine, right away it registers, it goes into your account, it's been returned. So you have nothing like that, you know, and then they put it back on the shelf. They haven't gotten to the point of where the robot will put it on the shelf, but the conveyor belt, no longer can you have any personal relations in returning the book. You have to return the book by conveyor belt, automatic, you know, check back in. Yeah. So,
And it makes this
More
question
time
of.
on the beat.
more time
Yep.
on the
Don't
beat.
have to work.
As a result, we're having a
Kinds of
nervous
opportunities.
breakdown in this society from stress levels and lack of interaction.
yes, of course, that's a good point, too.
They are
I want
working
you to make a
on,
phone call for me, anyway, I'm just teasing.
they are working on bots that can take care of that,
Yeah, oh, I'm sure of that, yeah.
if you catch my meaning.
Yeah, I got it, yeah.
But, you know, again, this shows the difficulties of the question at the present moment, because, let's say, whereas in the city, the spatial issue was not problematic. It was very straightforward. People live together in the same place, and they share their existence in the, not so much in production, because production was still based in the household, and you had the slaves, and you had, the production was still relatively separate, but the exchange was face-to-face. You went to the marketplace, and that was a place of real social. And then you had the political institutions, and the streets, the street life. You know, people live in the same place. You know each other, and you walk the same streets, and you have the meetings and so forth. There it was more or less straightforward. And it was doubly so because the classical notion of space was a Euclidean notion, in a sense, where each point was a repetition of the center. So you have, the ancient political world is you have a center and extending indefinitely outwards. Rome, for example, right? All roads lead to Rome. You have the imperial center, as it were, and then you have the influence. You know, as far as you know, that is a space which means what in this sense? If you are a citizen in Rome, anywhere you go, you're a citizen. And if you remember back when we read the Castelliades, he made the observation that when you had during the war with the Persians, where the Athenians and the Spartans were allies, and the Spartans were hesitant to agree with the Athenian strategy, which was the correct one, of course, in terms of the naval, to confront them with the smaller ships and to outmaneuver them that way. The Athenians said, "That's fine. We'll just move further west because Athens is us. Athens is the citizens. Anywhere the citizens are, that's Athens." And in fact, during times of war, the political meetings of Athens would occur, where the soldiers were, where the citizens were fighting the war. It was mobile. That's different from today, where the spatial organization of our society, and even of the city, certainly, mirrors the cellular space of capitalism, where you are physically changes who you are, let's say, or your status.
There's no agora in the modern city. There's no space to get to.
There's no public,
There's
no
no
public
public
space.
The
Yeah.
space is hierarchical, let's
Right,
say.
right.
So depending on where you first of all, in the ancient world, let's say, you don't escape to the surface because your status is always inscribed onto your person. It's not your let's say your class position is not a function of where you physically are in the city. or in the production process. It's intrinsic to you as a person. And anywhere you go, you can't escape it. You know, Spartacus cannot escape by leaving, let's say, Rome. You have to overthrow the system or redo the social hierarchies. Here, you know, if you are in the basement or you're in the penthouse, that is what determines your social position, let's say. You know, where you are, let's say, in the production process will determine your class specificity, in this case. Or where you live in the city, you know, there's no longer it's undifferentiated space where each point is a repetition of the previous one. It's a hierarchical space. So uptown, downtown, Manhattan, Brooklyn, whatever the case may be, is a very hierarchical one. And the question is then again, you have then now the abstract space. It's not just, we're not only talking about buildings, where these hierarchies are built into the architecture, built into the structures. You have also the abstract space of contemporary capitalism and where people fall within those structures as well, which again makes this question of the spatial world we live in and the democratic potentialities doubly difficult, because it's not just that the big factories are no longer fundamental, so we don't have that coming together of people. We have, even in the neighborhoods, as we were saying before, and the rest, a difficulty, because it's not even that we all live in the same neighborhoods anymore.
No, there's no local bar to go to for the neighborhood or after work. Think about how certain working class coalitions, you know, started in terms of neighborhoods or in the bars, and, you know, this was always moving. You know, this is a completely decentered, you know, I mean, this is the kind of politics that we have to think through. How does this
And you have
decentered universe and this
an
decentered
intensification
space
maybe of the
goes on?
hierarchies
Yeah.
within what were
Right.
more homogeneous
Right.
spaces in the, again, 50, 60 years ago, that made certain radical movements possible. And they existed. Certainly we can say that in the United States of the 1930s, the labor movement was of great consequence. It
Yes.
wasn't some, you know.
Well, where do you
minor
see
issue.
the potentialities for democratic education organization of the postmodern working class?
I don't see it. I mean, I don't know. I think we have some potential, let's say, from the standpoint of our commonality as debtors, let's say, on some level.
Desert.
Yeah. We're a debtor class.
We're a debtor
Yeah,
class
yeah.
by and large.
Right.
That's how we've been changed
And-
by
Right.
financialization.
But
And
that-
somewhat contingent as well. We're all
Yeah.
contingent, even though we may have jobs that give us checks, but we're still contingent.
But I guess I'm asking about a
Precarity.
spatial,
Yeah, uh-huh.
Well, I feel like
spatial
there
potentiality.
are some spaces, but the problem is they have been abstracted by like the internet. For example, the subway I think is a real space, but everyone's on their cell phone when you go on the subway, so no one has any interaction whatsoever. So the concrete space has been eradicated even when it exists still because of the internet, I think.
But
I
maybe-
I got a
I think
smile
it
today. I was
predates
reading
that.
Alice in Civilization, and the person across the.
It predates that, though.
Smiled.
If you look at Eliot's four quartets, there's a great passage there where he has people distracted from distraction by distraction. And it's a scene where all of these men are on the London Tube with newspapers
Right.
covering their
Yeah.
faces, and there's no interaction. So, I mean,
Right.
Eliot saw that then. We see what you pointed out,
Yeah.
that but it's kind of hard to use the subways as a meeting place or a
But is it
I
not
mean-
though? Like I
Well, it's
think
pretty
that
good in
it's parts of
the Warriors.
But, no, but maybe
Great
you're
book.
on
But I'm
something.
paying a specific rent.
Greater
That's why I
book,
live
too.
this far out in Brooklyn. So I am part of the class well, it's changing now because I couldn't afford to live there anymore, but I've been grouped into a class just by where I can afford to live within the city, so I am part
By
of that class.
distance.
And they're
so
not,
that subway, they have to use that subway too, that's part of our class.
and they're letting the subway system collapse.
Well, I was-
It's not
Exactly,
being
but I was
funded.
doing-
But I was gonna say, maybe you're onto something, because maybe a
Yeah.
struggle like the struggle to make a workable subway system, which
Yeah.
we increasingly don't have, that is
Yeah.
something that can bring people together.
we should
Not
complain
that
that
they
we don't
physically
wanna
are
be in the
meeting in that
sewer.
space, but because of the common interest
Yeah,
in
but
that
it's a common,
space.
yeah, it's a common,
As a
and
which is a
it can be
democratic.
also, of course,
space.
maybe one of the most radical possibilities is global warming,
Right.
where all these abstractions of, let's say, the nation state vanish because the global warming and the pollution, they don't care about, national
Boundaries.
sovereignty and boundaries.
And you're having
And it-
great migrations
You do,
because it.
of course, you do.
Yeah,
And
I mean, the
certainly
refugee
refugees-
caravan is
It's partly,
largely, well, partially driven. It's driven mostly by violence, but it's partially driven by the fact that there was a huge drought in
Right.
Central America
Right,
this
right,
year.
Right,
And the climate is changing there.
Right.
They can't grow
Right.
corn anymore.
right, right.
I think that's a world historic event.
Yes.
Yeah.
Event.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, to use the Lacanian jargon, the wheel asserts itself.
Right.
We have all the abstract
Right.
social categories, but when the acid rain comes, or the
drought.
drought comes, it cuts through these things, and the truth becomes that we all live, in a sense, together. We all live on the same planet, and we have a similarity, fundamental.
Except that, the rich are all, they're already building their bunkers and they're buying land in New Zealand
Well,
and their luxury bunkers.
Oh, and they're trying to
Well, they got
colonize.
planets,
They're not on the
planets,
same
that's
planet.
it. They're not
I-
only thinking the
Right.
globe, but they're preparing to go.
That's the real.
Yeah.
That's
Leave
the
the
real
planet,
dream,
right,
to
that's
have
the
their
real
own
dream.
planet where they
This
no
is the
longer
new
have to be
Promethean
divided.
energy of
Planet B.
of the ruling class, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Not Plan B, Planet B.
Planet B.
Well,
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Well, our primary demand is dismantle border imperialism.
I saw that. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
maybe-
those rich people are still living off the labor of other people. The people that are buying land in New Zealand and building bunkers are living off the labor of other people. So the role of labor.
They're gonna
go
tell you
back
they're
to
living
Rosa
off of
Luxemburg.
shareholder
The
capitalism.
role of labor is still
Right.
critical to understand.
No, of course, yes, yeah.
the possibility of moving beyond capitalism.
Yes. No,
Sure.
all the creative potentiality is in living labor. But the problem is that living labor, to the degree that the individualizing, the seriality becomes even much more fundamental than when Sartre was writing this. Which is one of the latter works, obviously, it's in the 70s already.
That was after the Maoist tribunal.
Yeah, this is 71
Yeah,
or
yeah,
72.
that was after they set up the tribunals after May of '68.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, really, and I think the emphasis on electoral politics itself is a symptom
Yeah.
of the decline of potentiality.
And all they talk about is the money. There's never issues out here anymore. It's all about who's spending the money. This is 90% of the commentary if you watch dominant media.
How much money is
How
being
much
spent?
money is being spent in these races.
Sure.
But the
And it's
most,
never about
um,
any of the issues. Nobody really
No.
brings up cost of living, the question of Social Security and Medicare.
Healthcare.
They let these things about $33 billion to go to Medicare for all, whereas no one even questions this or even breaks it down. It's unbelievable.
But to me, I don't really care about the horse race
Yeah.
aspect of the election, but to me, there's one ballot initiative in California which is incredibly just pathognomonic of this system. More money is spent on this ballot initiative than any other in the history of quote-unquote direct democracy, haha. ballot initiatives, and this is the one to limit dialysis centers. And over 100 million has been spent by the dialysis industry to block this. So what it turns out to be is a backdoor way for SEIU to get the union in the door of the dialysis centers, because the ballot initiative is to cap the profits. If they cap the profits, they have to invest in staff. And they're going to have to, it's putting pressure on them to unionize, which is a ridiculous way for the labor movement to go about organizing. Number two, we used to have diabetes centers all over the country to prevent amputations, blindness, and kidney failure. We don't have that anymore. We have dialysis centers, and they're so profitable
Right.
that they actually advertise during the World Series.
To go back to California,
That kind
that's
of money.
Chinatown, Jake. You can't go in
The
there.
dialysis industry had an advertisement to fight this ballot initiative
If,
during the World Series. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. That's how